Sameach to those of you here in Israel, and Erev Chanukah Sameach to those of you abroad. Jeff Sachs here from Beit Agnon, and we are rounding off, concluding our series on war, writing, and remembrance. We examine these four authors in chronological order, although I think either accidentally or not, it created a nice pattern development of the ideas that we saw. We started 3 weeks ago with Shalom Aleichem, going back to Simchat Torah and to the events of Simchat Torah, and then to events in the childhood as depicted in Eastern Europe, the Eastern European childhood that Shalom Aleichem described. And we use that in the context of trying to think about matters of trauma and how they stay with us. And then the next week, we turn to Bialik's Kishinev program, Be'ir HaRega, about the pogrom of 120 years ago, which still somehow resonates. And we considered how our current events might be similarly remembered, misremembered, represented, misrepresented, re-represented in art and literature that has yet to be created, although no doubt will come. Last week, we saw Agnon's, really, truly monumental Pticha Kaddish. We considered ways of engaging with theological questions through both liturgy and literature. But tonight, we actually are coming, after the whole month of doing this, coming to the first actual direct depiction of war as war. Kishinev, of course, was not a war. It was a pogrom, very violent, deadly, but not a war. And Rav Haim Sabato's novel of the Yom Kippur War, Adjusting Sights, which of course is available in a very fine translation by Hillel Halkin. The novel was published 25 years ago. It was published at the 25th anniversary of the war. And I think some of you, I see some of you online. I don't remember exactly. I see Gitti is online with us. I think that she was there in the days before Yom Kippur, just a few weeks ago. There were maybe a few others. We had an event at Beit Agnon, in which I spoke about this book, because it was a few days before Yom Kippur, and it was a few days before the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which I assume very many of us have direct memories. On that occasion, I told a story that even though I was a very young little boy, my first real memory of anything connected to Israel was the Yom Kippur War, and being told about it as a little boy, and my mom showing me on the globe that we had at home. People in those days had globes, showing me where Israel was and how tiny it was and how it was surrounded by so many enemies. But when we spoke about this at Beit Agnon, in those days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in advance of the 50th anniversary, we thought we were talking about 50 years, a half a century. It was ancient history, that time that a war broke out on the morning of a Jewish holiday, quite by surprise. Couldn't happen again. We've learned our lessons from that mechdal, from that calamity, that catastrophe, that blunder. And who could have imagined, of course, in tragic ways, that past is prologue, that history, if it doesn't exactly repeat, then it rhymes. And now returning to Tiyum Kavanot, even though some of the things I'll discuss now are repeating on things that I'd said on that occasion when we gathered in person, we see this all now through a completely different light. I don't know how many of you have read the novel. It's not terribly long. In English, it's all of the text is 144 pages. You can easily read it in 2 good sittings. And it's Sabato's prose is very straightforward. It's not like reading Agnon. Even though he's often compared to Agnon, which I'll come back to momentarily. You can really make your way through the book in 2 evenings, or one long evening, if you put yourself to it. So I really do recommend it if you haven't read the book, either in Hebrew or in English. Those of you here in Israel, you can get it in any Stematsky or Tzomet Sfarim, and if they don't have it in stock, they can have it in a day. And those of you abroad, you can certainly order it. Online. You see here on the cover of the book, both in Hebrew and English, you see this young soldier sitting on top of a tank. And you see behind him, either on the left or the right, depending upon whether you're looking at the Hebrew or English cover, you see the moon. The central symbol throughout the novel is the moon. The imagery of the Kiddush HaChodesh, the blessing that we say upon the appearance of the new moon on the Saturday night following Rosh Chodesh, following the new moon, at the waxing moon, at the sliver of the moon as it begins to increase, and then the fear of the waning moon, of the diminishing moon, of the darkness that's brought about, are central to the novel. The novel takes place over the course of about 2 months, those first 2 months of the war, from the night of Motzei Yom Kippur, when they're called up, to a Motzei Shabbat, a Saturday night, when there's Kiddush HaChodesh 2 months later. Remember, the Yom Kippur War was not terribly long. I mean, it wasn't a 6-day war. Remember, the day after Simchat Torah, as everything was happening, I remember saying to somebody, unfortunately, I was correct. Mark my words, this is not going to be a 6-day war. Unfortunately, it's not even a Yom Kippur war in the sense of how quickly we reached a lasting ceasefire. The Yom Kippur War began on the 6th of October, and it lasted until the active fighting really ended by October 25th. So it was about 3 weeks of active fighting, and then there was a long, tense time of a ceasefire, which was not fully observed, but at least in principle, it was a ceasefire. And the soldiers, of course, both the soldiers down in Sinai and the soldiers up in the Golan, where Sabato was with his tank unit, they stayed there in position for many months afterwards. Even though the active fighting was over within 3 weeks, the experience of the soldiers at the front went on for quite a long time afterwards. This symbol of the moon which waxes and wanes, which grows larger and then shrinks, of course, in rabbinic literature is always a metaphor for the fate of the Jewish people itself, that the Jewish nation and the vagaries of our own history, it's not in any way out of place in this novel. And the use of rabbinic literature and the use of rabbinic symbols fits in perfectly at a novel which, of course, is penned by someone who in his day job is a Rosh Yeshiva. Rav Haim Sabato was one of the founders of the Ma'ale Adumim, the Yeshivat Hesder Birkat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, and he remains today as its senior Rosh Yeshiva, and he spends his day teaching Gemara. I have visited him in his yeshiva. It's a very fine yeshiva. It's a large yeshiva Hesder, and he spends his day teaching Gemara and conventional Torah type things. And somehow on the side, he became one of modern Hebrew and modern Israel's leading novelists. He's also written, of course, Torah literature, more conventional Sfarim. But his novels and his collections of novellas and short stories are almost all largely autobiographically informed. None more than Adjusting Sights, which is the story of a young soldier whose name is Haim, who is sent off with his tank unit to fight in the Yom Kippur War on the Golan Heights, exactly as the author Haim Sabato did. He writes that the moon, you don't have this on the screen, the moon, Chazal said, the sages said, was like the people of Israel. For as the moonlight reflects the sun, so does Israel reflect God's presence. And as the moon wanes and waxes, so the destiny of Israel fades and grows brighter. And that serves as this kind of central motif of the novel, and serves as the opening scene for the novel. The novel begins on Motzei Yom Kippur, as Chaim and his best old dearest friend Dov are making their way to the departure point where the soldiers are being collected to be bussed off to wherever they're going, some up to the north, some down to the south. This is in Beit Vegan, in the neighborhood in Yerushalayim, in Beit Vegan. And Chaim, I'm going to call him Chaim to refer to the literary character as opposed to Rav Sabato, the author. Chaim and Dov go off to the deportation point, and it's Saturday night after Yom Kippur. And those of you that are careful about going to synagogue at the end of Yom Kippur, you know that after we blow the shofar and we dance a little and we daven Mariv, before we go home and break our fast, we have Kiddush HaChodesh. It's time to sanctify, to recite the blessing over the appearance of the new moon of that month of Tishrei. So as they're headed towards the bus, which is about to whisk them off to the front, they see the Amshanov Hasidim. There is a small Hasidic group called Amshanov. They're still active today. They have their center is in the Beit Vegan neighborhood in Yerushalayim, and they're there reciting the Kiddush HaChodesh. When the Hasidim see these two chayalim, these two soldiers, they say to them, "You must come with us to receive a blessing from our Rebbe, the Amshanova Rebbe." Now, this Amshanova Rebbe is an interesting character. The character who the Rebbe, who was the Rebbe in 1973, has since passed away, and I believe it's his son who is today the Amshanova Rebbe, and people go to him for blessings, and there are all types of interesting stories because they keep strange times. He davens very, very, very long. It takes him hours and hours just to daven Mariv. It takes him hours, I think, to say Birkat Hamazon, to bench after a meal. So the fact that they were only first saying Kiddush HaChodesh, this is a couple of hours after Yom Kippur has ended, but they're only first getting to Kiddush HaChodesh is perfectly realistic and may actually represent what actually happened in reality. So the book opens, a pure moon shone overhead, not a cloud hid it from sight. And this is, again, the night Motzei Yom Kippur. And he and Dov make their way to the bus that's going to take them off, to whisk them off to the Syrian front. The Hasidim are singing and dancing the songs of Motzei, of Kiddush HaChodesh and Motzei Yom Kippur. And they bring him to the Rebbe. And the rabbi of Amshanov clasped my hands warmly between his own two and said, looking directly at me, Eimasa v'fachad tipol aleihem. Right? May dread and fear befall them. Aleihem velo aleichem. Upon them and not upon you. It's a line from the Kiddush HaChodesh that's recited, that we talk about the arrival of David Melech Yisrael, David the king, and how he should be victorious, and how fear should be cast upon the enemies of the good. He looks at him repeating this line from the prayer and says, dread and fear should fall on them, meaning there's no doubt on who the antecedent of them is, on the Syrians, and not you. We parted from him and boarded the bus. We thought we'd be back soon because, who knew? I mean, remember Simchas Torah, right? Who knew, right? Like who knew how long things would be? During the 3 terrible days that followed, I kept seeing the rabbi of Amshanov before me. I kept hearing his words. Each time fear threatened to overcome me, I pictured him saying, Aleihem velo aleichem. them and not you, them and not you. That calmed me. That calmed me until, spoiler alert, right here on the second page, the third page of the text. No, I'm sorry, on page 5. Until I heard of Dov's death. After that, the old man stopped appearing. So right here at the opening of the novel, we have this terrible spoiler that his dear best friend is going to be killed in this war. And in reality, we know that Haim Sabato, the author, had a dear best friend, Dov Indig, who had been his chevruta, with whom he had grown up in the Beit Mazmil Merkaz Klita, the absorption center for all the Olim that had arrived in Israel in the 40s and 50s. They grow up together and they study together and they learn together and they talk together. And Indig was, by all accounts, by people who knew him, he was just a magnificent soul. And he indeed was killed in the war. And part of the novel is that in those early chaotic days of the war, particularly on the Golan, nobody knew anything. And all Haim knows is that Dov has gone missing and is presumed dead. But he doesn't know exactly what happened to him. And that need to know, that need to find out, which of course now returns to us. This is something I wasn't sufficiently, let's say, sensitive to when we last met a few days before Yom Kippur. How this idea of the idea that Dov is missing, we don't know where he is. He's, presumed dead, but we don't know a thing. That returns to us with such force now. So these two themes are already located immediately right now in the opening of the novel. One is the anxiety of the omnipresent absence of Dov. And the other is this question of fear and trembling. And how he's a young boy, right? He's 19 years old, 20 years old. And he's going off to war. And he has to control himself. He can't let fear overcome him. And he's comforted by the words of the Rebbe that fear should fall upon the enemy and not upon him. Right? And he was told by the Hasidim, come, get a blessing from our Rebbe, because our Rebbe is a wonder worker, and his blessing can perform wonders and perform miracles. So he knows that he and Dov both receive the same blessing. But it doesn't seem to work, at least not for everyone. Now, the character of Haim in the novel maintains absolute perfect faith throughout, which is so fascinating. His faith and trust, his bitachon, his trust in God is absolute, even in the face of trauma and tragedy and loss. But the question of how does he square that with the reality around him is just such it's what makes this really one of the truly remarkable pieces of modern Israeli literature, even though it's a very deeply religiously informed work of, I will call it a work of fiction, even though it's obviously based on real events. It's written and prepared as a work of literature, but it's no conventional war story. It's a kind of, coming of age story mixed with some kind of guide for the perplexed. Because this question of faith in the face of struggle and trauma is central to his experiences. And no doubt anyone who's struggling with questions, I mean, look, people struggle with questions of faith even in easy times. But in these most traumatic of times, a person can be forgiven for struggling with questions of faith. And the novel, which again is it's a novel, it's a work, it's an aesthetic work, it's a work of art, right? It doesn't set out to be the Mesilat Yesharim, right? But the novel itself can be a very profound engagement with these questions, and I dare say it could probably help people think through these challenges. If it's not a guide to the perplexed, it's a guide to the inner life of a perplexed young soldier student, a young yeshivat hesder, a chayal in yeshivat hesder. For those of you that may just be unfamiliar, yeshivat hesder, yeshivot hesder are the system of yeshivot where students go off to yeshiva after high school, and they integrate their army service together with studying in yeshiva over the course of a number of years. As the novel unfolds, there's a brilliant narrative technique that he employs. At some point after the active fighting has stopped, there's a kind of, not a commission of inquiry. You'll be hearing lots about commissions of inquiry, hopefully soon. Hopefully as soon as the war is over. But there are these commissions of inquiry, not debriefing sessions, I should say, where because it was such chaos during those first days of the war, they send this tribunal of people to debrief the soldiers. That this was actually done, and it was done at the front, while in some cases while the fighting was still going on, and in other cases during this uneasy ceasefire, because it was so important to try to learn as much about what happened, what went wrong, while people's memories were still fresh. So they have these debriefing sessions, and each soldier or groups of soldiers are called in to, not to testify, they're not on trial, but they're giving this debriefing. Each of them is telling their story in front of a military historian, a psychologist, and a military intelligence officer. And through this technique of Haim and two of his comrades telling their stories, we witness the events of those first days of the war in flashback. And it's a brilliant technique by which he integrates different time settings in the novel. The action of the novel takes place from the night after Yom Kippur until almost exactly 2 months later, on the Saturday night of the Kiddush HaChodesh, 2 months later. But through the flashbacks, we see what happens in the battle. And through other flashbacks, we learn about his relationship with Dov and their childhood together in the absorption center in Yerushalayim. But these debriefing sessions are a kind of attempt to make sense of the inexplicable, right? Each of them tell the story of the trauma of those days of the war. I mean, think about what the stories that the people from the kibbutzim and from Otef Aza and from Be'eri and from Sderot and from, you name it, think of the stories that are going to come out once those people, start going on the record and sit for interviews and for oral histories. It's just going to be mind-boggling. And this is what happens. This is kind of way of trying to make sense of that which cannot be understood, cannot be explained. Two of the three students Chaim and one other, are yeshiva students, and their stories are framed very much from within the perspective of faith. Now, there's no rabbi that's sitting on this panel to question them about their trauma or to process their aftermath and this question of how they were able to maintain faith in the face of what they saw and what they experienced. And one suspects that writing this novel writing Ti'um Kavanot 25 years after the war was itself a kind of form of spiritual debriefing that Sabato undertakes in order to process some of those experiences. What's really fascinating, both about the depiction in the in the um, in the book, in the debriefing, as well as the book itself, is there's absolutely no politics. In that way, it's unusual for this kind of war novel. I think last week we talked about political satire. I mentioned in passing the great 70s and 80s TV show that so many of us, came up on MASH, right? So MASH is it's hard to fit into a box. It was not a comedy. It wasn't a sitcom, although of course it was also that. And it wasn't a conventional drama either, because it had so much comedic, satiric. But think of how much of the thrust, both of the satire of the comedy and of the drama, had a political bent to it. Not just because it was trying to make a comment on the Vietnam War, with which the show was largely contemporaneous, at least in the early years. But in terms of that's the the kind of idea that the people that are there in the thick of it, in the mud of the mobile army surgical hospital, dealing with the wounded, they understand better than the generals. They understand better than the Pentagon, what's going on and what should be done. It's such a common trope in so many war movies. It's completely absent from Adjusting Sights. If you read Adjusting Sights, you would learn nothing about the command structure, about anybody that's above the commander, his commander in the tank, right? You don't know who the Ramatkal is. You don't know who the chief of staff is. You don't know who the minister of defense is. You don't know who the prime minister is. Now, if you've seen, this movie, again, bizarre timing, this movie that came out about Golda Meir, starring Helen Mirren, which depicts those days of the Yom Kippur War from the exact opposite perspective. Right? I mean, within the Israeli sphere, it's the opposite perspective. Instead of the perspective of the lowly soldier in the tank, it's the perspective of the prime minister and the chief of staff and the minister of defense and the head of the military intelligence. And it's told not from within a tank on the Golan, it's told from within the Kiryah, within the military headquarters in the situation room, as the battle unfolds. And the battle, you hear the battle, but you don't see it. You don't really see any battle scenes. They're in the situation room with like around the table with the big map and those little toy models of tanks that they move around. And over the radio, over the intercom, they hear what's going on in the battle, and they understand how badly it's going. But it's off screen, it's off stage. You're seeing it through Golda's perspective as she comes to terms and understands how terrible it's going. So in Sabato's novel, there's none of that. There's no politics, right? It's about the experience of the soldier himself, and in this particular case, it's the experience of the soldier grappling with his faith. The soldier receives a blessing from the Amshon of a Rebbe, and if that blessing presents a particular, let's say, theological thorn, the Rebbe can do wonders, and the Rebbe gave a blessing to me and to Dov, but it doesn't seem to work. So in his yeshiva, which is decidedly not Hasidic, at the end of Yom Kippur, as a certain number of the boys in the yeshiva are going off, they've already been called up, and they know they have to report on Motzei Yom Kippur to go off to the front. The Rosh Yeshiva gathers them together, and he, knowing that they're soon to go off and be tested in battle, he wants to fulfill the dictate of the Gemara to part with words of Torah. So he gives them what's apparently like a mini shiur, probably of just a few moments to give them a little strength and to hearten them as they're about to go off into battle. And he teaches them a halacha from the Rambam. Maimonides has a work called Hilchot Malachim, the laws of kings and their war. One of the responsibilities of a king is to conduct the wars of Israel. So there's a section of this larger work that deals with the conduct of war. And the Rambam, this is Rambam Hilchot Malachim, Perek Zayin Halacha Tedvav 7:15, and he tells the Rambam says that, look, the Rambam is aware, there's a pasuk, there's a verse that says soldiers shouldn't be afraid. But the Rambam was no fool, right? The Rambam understood that fear is a very natural human emotion. As a matter of fact, it's a somewhat healthy human emotion, because fear creates a defense mechanism. So the Rambam asks, so what does that pasuk mean? What does that verse mean? That if there's a man who's afraid or faint-hearted, right, he shouldn't go off to war. The phrase should be interpreted simply as applying to a person whose heart is not brave enough to stand in the throes of battle. Once a soldier enters the throes of battle, he should rely on the Mikveh Yisrael, the hope of Israel and their savior in times of need. He should realize that he is fighting for the sake of the unity of God's name. Therefore, he should place his soul in his hand and not show fright or fear, as it is written, do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, do not panic, and do not break ranks before them. Because a person who shows, a soldier who shows fear or cowardice on the battlefield, he disheartens all of his comrades, and then things really go bad. In contrast, anyone who fights with his entire heart without fear, with the intention of sanctifying God's name alone, can be assured that he will find no harm, nor will bad overtake him. This teaching, it's interesting. When I started thinking about this, I know that Rav Sabato teaches Maimonides very frequently, and that he teaches, he gives regular shiurim in the Rambam. So on their yeshiva's website, they have, like a whole archive of written and audio shiurim. It's very well organized, and you can find all of the shiurim that Rav Sabato has taught on the Rambam. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? Here, what does he do? Wearing his hat as an author, he puts these words of the Mishnah Torah into the mouth of a fictionalized Rosh Yeshiva. I'm not here concerned with the question of did it really happen? Like in 1973, as young Haim Sabato, the actual biographical figure who lives in Yerushalayim, as he was going off to war, what did the Rosh Yeshiva say to them? I'm not interested in that. And the truth is, if you ask him, if you try to engage him in this question of what's fact and what's fiction and what's made up, he doesn't engage in the question at all, right? He finds it quite agitating. We know that some of the figures in the novel are biographical. We know that they're people with these names. We know that Dov was Dov Indig, right? And then there are other figures who are fictionalized. Names have been changed. Events have been changed. We can't presume that the dialogue in the book is lifted word for word for some kind of imaginary transcript that he made. And it's less interesting, this question of is it real? Isn't it real? Is it memoir or is it fiction? It's presented as a work of fiction. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? Here he takes this halacha from the Rambam and puts it into the mouth of a fictionalized Rosh Yeshiva in a novel. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at what Rabbi Sabato, as teacher of Torah in the non-fictional world, in the actual yeshiva, what he has said in teaching this halacha in a more conventional setting of a shiur, the kind of things that rabbis usually do. So I looked in the catalog, and I saw he's taught like every halacha in the Rambam, but not this one. Not this section of the Rambam. And I thought that was really interesting, that the material that he uses, the raw material that he uses for his novel, he never got around to teaching actually as a piece of Torah. So when I asked him about this, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Indeed, it is. Indeed, it is a bit curious," was what he said to me. Right? He said it was a bit curious that I think he might have been playful. I think he understood my question. I wasn't trying to psychoanalyze him. Like this one halacha of all is one of the few that you've left. When the character of Chaim recalls this halacha about the need not to fear and the need to fight, what the proper intention, what the kavanah, and remember, this is a book called Ti'um Kavanot, right? The Hebrew title, Adjusting Sights, we'll come back to it in a moment, but it's about kavanah, about intention. What the proper intention in war is or should be. So this teaching, we don't see it in the action of the novel. It's something that Chaim recalls in a half dream. After the first month of the war, he was given a 24-hour pass. He was given a leave to go home. And it's the first time that he's going back home. And he gets a tremp, he hitches a ride. He takes most of the time to get home. Is most of the time on his leave is used trying to get a ride from the Golan back to Yerushalayim. And in the ride, he's exhausted. Now this is a perfect plot device. Any of you that have had children in the army know, my son was in the army. Now he's in Miluim, but when he was in the army, and he, thank God, did his service, even though he was a combat soldier. He was a combat soldier in Givati, which is the unit which has been, Rachmana litzlan, I think, most hard hit. Even not just Givati, but his particular unit has been very terribly hit, has suffered a lot of losses these past 2 months. He served in a relatively quiet period. There wasn't too much action in the years he was in the army. Now and then there'd be something. But even in a normal week, he'd come home on Friday for Shabbos. He'd fall asleep, the second he sat down in shul. And we'd get home and he'd be asleep. We'd make kiddush and hamotzi, and he'd be asleep, before the challah was down his throat. He would conk out on the couch. You couldn't move. So soldiers are always exhausted. And soldiers in war are prone to nightmares. So in this half dreamlike state, riding in this tremp, in this hitched ride that he gets to Yerushalayim, all of these questions about faith and doubt come back to him and are rehearsed and repeated and recycled through this exhausted, dreamlike, nightmarish fog of war. And on that ride back to Yerushalayim, he knows he's going home for Shabbos, and it's going to be Kiddush HaChodesh. It's 1 month later. And it's the Kiddush HaChodesh, not of Tishrei, but of Cheshvan, or as it's known by its nickname, Mar Cheshvan, which at least the folk etymology means it's the bitter month. We know it as the month of, it's the month when the weather turns cold. Any depiction of what life on the Golan was like during those weeks of the war, it was bitter cold and rain and mud. And now it's the Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan, the bitter month. It's called the bitter month because it's the holiday that it's the month that has no holidays in it, right? It's just 30 days to get from here to there. And the new moon of Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan is covered in clouds, as is often the case. You're not always able to recite the blessing on the new moon if it's a dark and cloudy night. But worse than that, he's fearful that people are going to ask him. He says he's fearful of encountering people who will want to know where I had been and where I was going and what I had been doing and what did I think? What would I say? That I had been in the war? That I had met my own self there. Everybody probably has had an experience where you really feel isolated, where you really feel alone, where you really feel that you've undergone something that no one else could possibly understand. So he's fearful about going home. He's fearful about going home because they're going to want to know what happened. And what's he going to say? How is he going to explain? How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you explain what you yourself don't understand that you underwent to somebody that has no frame of reference? It's something we should keep in mind for our friends and loved ones and neighbors and children and grandchildren who are now off at war and come home, for a 48-hour pass or for whatever it is. How much we have to respect the privacy of what's incommunicable to us. So he says, what should I say? That I had been to the war, that I had met myself there. Now, Sabato is very often compared to Kafka. Sabato is very often compared to Agnon. Agnon is sometimes compared to Kafka. Why did I say Kafka? What a Freudian slip. Sabato is very often compared to Agnon, a comparison to which he does not completely accept it, even though he has tremendous admiration for Agnon. Agnon has a book about war. Agnon has a few books about war. When Agnon talks about the war, generally speaking, he's talking about World War I. During World War I, that was the period in which Agnon had left the land of Israel and had gone to Europe and spends the war years in Germany. Remember, Agnon was a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He lives in Germany. He's liable to be drafted, which he was completely unsuited for temperamentally, and manages to dodge the draft the whole war. And he writes 2 novels. I think some of you were with us this year in Germany. Who was with us in Germany? I'm looking to see. Oh, maybe not. Maybe not. No, I don't think so. If I'm wrong, please chat me. Judith Romani is here, was with us in Germany. So in Germany, we spoke a lot about these 2 novels, his novels of the home front in World War I in Germany. One is Adhena, to this day. The other is Bechanuto Shel Mar Lublin, in Mr. Lublin's store. And then there are, of course, a variety of other short stories. But in To This Day, we have the following scene. The character says, somehow I managed to fall asleep. Later in the passage, you don't have it on the screen, the speaker is considering the idea, the way that, like, in Hebrew you can change letters around and they change meaning, but midrashically we think the ideas are all connected. That the word milchama, if you change the words around, you have the word hachalom, that dream and war are somehow interconnected. So somehow I managed to fall asleep. The reason I know that I did this is because I had a dream. What did I dream? I dreamed that a great war had broken out and that I was called up to fight, and took a solemn oath that if God brought me home safe and sound, I would sacrifice to him whatever came forth from my house to greet me. I returned home safe and sound, and behold, coming forth to greet me was myself. Now, of course, you may identify the source here. Did anybody... Oh, I'm sorry. I see that there were other people with... Oh, Rifki. I see. Not everybody has their names up on the screen, so I don't know who's who. Rifki and Jay are with us. They were with us in Germany, and Aviel is with us. Oh, and the Collinses are here. So everybody knows what I'm talking about. Not everybody, but some of you know what I'm talking about when we talked about Germany and the home front. So a number of you were with us, and no doubt you remember what we said there. But I'm wondering, do you catch the reference here? What is the character in To This Day saying? Right? He takes a solemn oath that if he returns safe from the war, he'd sacrifice whatever comes out of the house to greet, and he opens the door, and it's surreal. This is Kafkaesque. He opens the door, and who does he see greeting himself? He sees himself, which means he has to commit himself. Rina is Aviel, I guess. Aviel reminds us this is Yiftach in Sefer Shoftim in the book of Judges, chapter 11. We have the well-known story of Yiftach, Jephthah, who makes this bizarre neder that if he's returned, whoever comes out to whatever comes, presumably he means the first sheep or the first goat. But who comes to greet him first is his own daughter, and he sacrifices his own daughter in this bizarre and gruesome story. So that's what Agnon is picking up on, right? That the soldier ultimately understands that even if he returns safe and sound, it comes at a cost. And that's probably what Sabato is picking up. Haim, the character, returns having met himself in the war, right? But the loss of Dov is hanging over him, right? He understands that with the loss of Dov, he's lost himself, right? We hear the Talmudic phrase "O chevruta o mituta." It's almost hidden there between the lines of what it means that give me my chevrusa, my friend, my study partner, my intellectual partner, or give me death. And having lost Dov, he knows he's lost part of himself. Now, this question about Agnon's influence on Sabato, I spoke about this a bit when we met in Beit Agnon. I don't want to spend too much time on it now. What the critics misunderstood when Sabato started writing his fiction, they immediately made comparisons to Agnon, because they figured any author that quotes the Gemara and quotes the Midrash and quotes the Tfilot is trying to put on Agnonian airs. This was not true. It was a misunderstanding on the part of many critics that this is the way Talmidei Chachamim, this is the way Torah scholars speak and write. And if you pepper your talk with references to the Talmud, that's not trying to speak Agnonian. That's actually quite authentically the way that yeshiva students speak. Years later, when Sabato and other friends put out these letters to Talia, Indig, Dov, this is the actual Dov Indig here. In the novel, his last name is never given. It's just Dov. And by the way, part of Chaim's ambivalence about going home on that first leave a month into the war is that he knows he's going to have to go see Dov's widowed mother, and she's going to want to know what do you know, right? I mean, it's like these people. I mean, I don't know if he's on with us. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me mentioning it, but the fellow that works with us here in Beit Agnon, Tal Levi, he might be listening in. He's in charge of all the Zooms that we do. His brother, right? His brother is in Gaza. We hope he is. We hope he is alive and well. Or Levi, he's 33 years old. His wife, Rahman al-Islam, was killed on the first day of the war. They have a small baby that happened to have been at the grandparents when they went down to that party, and he was taken hostage, and she was killed. And just not knowing, right? It's killing everybody. Pardon the expression, right? Just not knowing is sometimes the worst of all. So Dov's mother says, "No, what do you know?" So that's part of why he doesn't want to go, because he doesn't like the need to engage with that. So years later, it was discovered Indig was a youth leader. He was a madrich in Tnuat Noar, and he had conducted a long correspondence in those days before cell phones, when people wrote letters on paper with stamps and ink. And he had conducted a long correspondence with a girl named Talia, who saved the letters. in which he discussed, she would write to him, and he was one of these kinds of like remarkable figures. Kids would flock to him. He was a kind of like big brother to people. Like I think of some of the figures that were influential in my own life when I was coming up. Figures in the youth movements and older role models, and he would answer her questions about religion, about faith, about all types of things, about life. And these letters were published posthumously sometime in the I think in the 90s, and they were translated to English as well. So when you read these letters of Dovindik, you see that this is so authentic, right? The dialogue that we see in the novel is exactly the way these characters speak and write in real life. And not only that, it's so not Agnonian, right? The fact that a character who spends all of his day learning in yeshiva, and when he's there sitting on a tank with a free minute, takes out a Gemara or takes out a Chumash to learn a little Torah. The fact that such a character should populate his speech with phrases taken from those holy texts is not at all surprising. It's not because the author is trying to write like Agnon. As a matter of fact, none of the writing is in any way, let's say, ornamented in the way that Agnon's writing is. Agnon's writing can really be sometime a little bit labyrinthine, right? It's sometimes a little bit like a maze. You have to struggle to read it. You can't read a novel of Agnon's in one night, in bed as you're a little drowsy in one eye. Sabato's writing is really very straightforward and clear. And not only that, but the characters, the characters in the tank, they talk tank talk. The only concession that he probably makes is that, in real life in a tank, there's probably a certain amount of like juicy swear words that are tossed around. Soldiers talk like soldiers. We've all seen movies, so that's a little bit toned down or filtered out. That's probably a concession that Sabato does make to his day job as a Rosh Yeshiva. But the confusion on the part of the critics is it misses the point. It misses the points in a way that Sabato's writing really is Agnonian, and that's not because of the phrases and the quotes that are woven into the text. It's because of some larger themes in which he's examining questions about Jewish life. Sabato's attempt to deal with what it means for Israel to fight a war is different than other writers. And in this regard, it's a bit more similar to Agnon, because Agnon didn't document. Agnon wasn't a Sabra writer. He wasn't documenting the wars of Israel in Israel by and large. We don't ever encounter in Sabato the phrase, which is actually, if you've seen, I'm curious how many people have seen the Golda movie, because it's so woven throughout there. That old Israeli slogan of Milchemet Ein Breira, right? In other words, you see in the movie Golda, I mean, this is true, this isn't fictionalized. It's not at all clear like who came up with this slogan or when it was first used, but the idea that Israel has to win its wars because we have no choice, right? If Egypt fights against Israel and Egypt loses, they're still in Egypt. There's still a Syria. There's still a Jordan. But if they fight against Israel and Israel loses, then there's no more Israel. So we have to win the war because the consequences of losing the war are just too great to imagine. It's greater than however many soldiers will perish. It's greater, certainly, than however many tanks and planes will be lost. It's the existence of the Jewish state. So in Golda's turn of phrase, we have to win the war because we have no choice. Milchemet ein breira. That's so woven into the Israeli ethos. It has no currency whatsoever. It doesn't appear and isn't hinted to anywhere in Sabato's writing, because Sabato doesn't talk the language of politics or military strategy. He talks the language of Jewish faith. And in that regard, he's similar to Agnon. For Sabato, this is not a milchemet ein breira, a war of no choice. It's a milchemet mitzvah, the halachic category of obligatory war that is forced upon the Jewish people in order to preserve the Jewish people. That's the language that he speaks. And that changes it from a political military focus to a moral cause of a different order. The moral rationale elevates the war from one of salvation for a political entity, as important as that political entity is, to one of national redemption. Right? And that's all the difference in the world in thinking about the war through the prism of this one lowly soldier in a tank. This question about faith, the question about maintaining the faith, then becomes very central. In a different work, a work that hasn't been translated, it's not exactly a novel. It's a kind of, well, I'll call it a novel. It's really a collection of stories that are linked together, called B'Shafrir Chevyon. B'Shafrir Chevyon, which the title might be translated as hidden in sealed away in the hidden vault. So in a section which I translated, and by the way, I think some of you know that I'm the editor of the journal Tradition. So much of what I'm sharing with you tonight was written up in an essay that came out last summer in a special issue of Tradition about the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. I wrote an article about adjusting sights, and Sabato contributed, he allowed us to translate a chapter from this book. In that chapter, he talks about the reception of the novel. The novel was written 25 years after the war, meaning 25 years ago. And he revisits some of those ideas. So in B'Shafir Chevyon, he goes back and retells a story that appears in Adjusting Sights, but he adds an element to it that he omitted years earlier from Adjusting Sights. He writes that as the tank is burning, at that moment, the secret of prayer was revealed to me, and the secret of faith that fills all the chambers of the heart. As for me, it is good to draw near to God. He quotes a verse from the Psalms. That's when I understood our sage's statement about the servant girl's vision while standing at the Red Sea. That a lowly servant standing, witnessing the redemption at the Red Sea, had greater visions than all the prophets. Roni, the tank driver, shouted to me after we jumped from the tank, Chaim, what do you feel? Their tank has been hit. It's flaming. They have to escape. And as they're jumping from the flaming tank, the driver says to them, Chaim, what do you feel? And we both shouted, Shviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. I place the Lord before me always. When I wrote Adjusting Sights, I debated whether to write what we had shouted. I didn't dare, so I didn't write it. I said, who will believe us? Now that I have told it, I knew they were there. Now, in the context, what he's doing is he's been describing in this chapter, and you can go to traditiononline.org and read the whole chapter, or you can email me and I can send it to you. He had been describing the encounter with soldiers who had been there in the war, who read Adjusting Sights and confront him, right? Because they recognize that he is telling their story, but they want more of the story, right? They somehow think that that he has access to some hidden archive, right? That he has the answers to what happened here and what happened there. What it was he was telling his own story. It was so authentic that other people thought he somehow had clairvoyance. And now he realizes that what I didn't write in the novel, the people that were there, if you were there, you'll understand. If you weren't there, I can't explain it to you. They would believe it. But the moderator of this panel discussion that he was participating in years after, when they were recalling their experiences in the war, he wouldn't let me be. He says, what of the pain, the fear, the burned tanks around you, your good friends? What did it do to your faith? So on this panel discussion, years after the war, I answer him. Every moment my faith grew stronger. I can't explain to you why. Maybe because I saw with my own eyes what a person's life is, and I stood alone in front of my Creator. Perhaps from the power of pure, simple prayer, everything I learned all my life, everything I read and heard in yeshiva concerns simple faith. These feelings of the heart burned in me so much, to such an extent, that I remember saying to myself then, I know the day will come when the heart will be numb. I know days will come when I will have forgotten everything. Such is the way of the world. New things sweep out the old. Heartbreak gives way in the face of routine. And who knows what my faith will be then. This is what he says to himself when he's a young man in the tank. Therefore, I said to myself, and this is incredible. He's in the tank. He's lost his best friend. The war is going disastrously, and his faith is strong. But he says he knows one day he'll be middle-aged. And sometimes you get older, and you right as he thinks, he says, if I make it out of this, I'm gonna be like a fat middle-aged bald man, right? Working, raising kids, doing the grind. That may wear me down. But now here I am, life and death, tanks burning, soldiers falling. Now my faith is strong. But I know one day it may weaken. So I will write on a note what is inscribed in my heart. And every time I weaken in my faith, I will look at it and I will remember. And he writes a little piyut, a little kind of poem. And in the tank, he says, in the tank that he was a gunner. The gunner sits down way below in the tank, in the belly of the tank. It actually, apropos of Yom Kippur, the description is very reminiscent of Jonah in the belly of the whale. And he's down there in the tank with the periscope through which he looks to fire. And he says the gunners used to tape up, different things on the periscope. Sometimes they'd tape a picture of their girlfriend. Sometimes they'd put up a drawing that their little kid had sent them, or a letter from their wife. So he writes this little poem about faith, this little rhyme, and that's what he tapes there. And that will remind him as he goes forward. But what happens during one of the intermissions? The tank is back at the base and they wash it down with this high power hose, and everything, the note gets destroyed and lost. But as we see in certain Agnon stories, the idea that a text itself is written means that in heaven it has some power. Once something is committed to writing, it has some eternal force. And one wonders if the whole of Adjusting Sights isn't there in place of that note, which is the record of how his faith was maintained. But what really happens back in our novel is the Adjusting Sights. And this is the meaning of the title, or the double entendre, the double meaning of the title. I don't understand much of this, but it's been explained to me. The gunner in a tank sits below and looks through a periscope to aim where he's supposed to fire. The aiming mechanism has to be adjusted, right? There's a kind of crosshairs, and it very often becomes unadjusted. because the tank goes bumping around and banging around. And if it's not in sync, think of like tuning a piano, right? In other words, if you move a piano, even with the gentlest of movers from one house to another, when you get it set up in the new house, I mean, I'm talking about like a good piano, the tuner has to come, because in the move, some strings were stretched and it got a bump and a bang, and it goes out of tune. It has to be retuned in order to be properly adjusted. So the same thing with this adjusting mechanism. Before you go out to a mission, there's a certain tool that they use to calibrate the firing scope. Without it, you have no way to accurately fire, right? The gun isn't aligned with what the gunner is seeing, so he has no way to properly aim and shoot. In the chaos of those early days of the war, the soldiers, the tankistim, the tank soldiers, show up in the Golan. The tanks themselves are in bad condition. They're not even assigned to their normal teams. Each tank has four people in it, the loader and the gunner and the driver and the commander, and they're not even together with their team with whom they normally work and with whom they have a kind of, they're just assigned. This tank needs a gunner, that tank needs a loader, that tank needs a driver, right? And they're going off. And as he gets into his tank, he realizes they don't have the calibrating mechanism. So they're going off to fight, and the cannon of the tank is not adjusted. But of course, lita'em kavanot, to adjust the gun sights, is a double meaning of to adjust kavanah, the intention one needs in prayer. They're going off to the battle. The battle is taking place in a quarry. There's a quarry up in the Golan called Nafach. So you know what a quarry looks like. It's kind of like a big pit dug out. So the tanks are going in there, and it's like almost like sitting ducks, because there's high ridge all around. And they're ambushed. They're ambushed by the Syrians. And he writes, in the ambush in Nafach, with no radio, with an auxiliary charger to ignite the tank, to get the tank started, and an unadjusted gun sight, and the missiles coming closer, and the tanks around us bursting into flames, Giddy had shouted, "Gunner, pray, we're taking fire, Tpalel." Giddy, the commander, is not religious, but he knows that Haim, the yeshiva boy, is religious. So here we've got nothing. We have no weapon, because we can't fire. So what does the Jew, even the most secular Jew, know? When you're under fire and you have no weapon, you always have one thing left in your arsenal: pray. So he says to his religious comrade, pray, we're taking fire. And Chaim says, I prayed. There wasn't a hair's breadth between my heart and my lips. I had never prayed like that before. The essay that I published about the novel was called Point Blank Prayer. What does it mean to fire point blank? Point blank means you take the gun and it's right there on the target. You don't need, when you're shooting point blank, you don't need to aim. You don't need lita'em kavanot. What does it mean to pray in a situation like this? Right? It means, what's kavanah? Kavanah means that when you pray, your heart is directed in the right place. Right? You send a letter, you get the zip code right. Right? But when you're right there already, it's the Rambam, very famously, towards the end of the Guide for the Perplexed, has this long metaphor of the palace of the king, of God in the palace, and who gets to enter the palace, and who gets to go into the private quarters, and who gets to go into the antechamber, and who gets to go all directly into the chamber of the king. So if you're there in the chair, see, Sabato's done something incredibly radical. He's taken the idea of the Rambam and has metaphorized it as a soldier in a burning tank, jumping from a burning tank. That's what it means to be in the palace of the king. That's what it means to be in the hand of God. It's getting a bit late, and I do want to finish up because some of us have to go and eat a sufganiya or a latke or something. But the very end of the novel, it's now 2 months later. The first Kiddush HaChodesh on Motzei Yom Kippur, he gets the blessing from the Rebbe, and he goes off with perfect faith. And then he spends 2 months trying to figure out how to coordinate the belief in those blessings and the power of his own faith with the very messy reality around him and the trauma of having lost his best friend. A month later, it's the dark, moonless night of Mar Cheshvan, and he doesn't know what to answer anyone, and he only knows that he's found himself, and to find yourself in war means a little bit, you are the sacrifice. And now it's 2 months later. The active fighting is already over. It's Rosh Chodesh Kislev. It's our month. It's the month of Hanukkah. And on the first Saturday night after Kislev, he's there still up in the cold Golan. It's the darkest night of winter. I looked at the moon and I saw Dov. We had sanctified the moon of Tishrei together, the two of us, in Bayit Vagan with the Rabbi of Amshinov. It was true, I thought. Sometimes God had mercy on the undeserving and shone his light on them. That mercy and that light stayed with you forever. They were a debt you had to repay. He's speaking about himself. Right? Two soldiers go off to war bearing the same blessing, but only one comes back. The one who comes back with a debt to repay. Now, I don't know Rav Sabato well enough to understand how he interprets that debt that he carries, but there's no doubt that he's writing something very, very personal here. There was no getting around it. I thought of the vow I had made while dodging bullets in the wadi. I knew the world would never be the same. Yes, sometimes God has mercy on the undeserving, and sometimes he descends to his garden, to the beds of spices to gather lilies. These are references to verses in Shir Shirim of the worthy who are plucked or cut down. And he mentions Sariel and Shmuel and Shaya and Avihu, comrades who fell, and Dov. Though we left for the war together, what was it Rabbi Akiva once said? The owner of the fig tree knows when it's time to gather his figs. Who can aim his thoughts as high as those of the creator of men? In the month of Elul, we say slichot, penitential prayers in my yeshiva. Now they echoed in my ears, and he recalls the words of the slichot that they had said just a few weeks earlier. Who holds in his hands the soul of all that live and the spirit of each mortal man. The soul is yours and the body is your handiwork. Haneshamalach, v'aguf pa'alach, chusana alamalach. Spare the work of your hands. Lord of all souls, the soul is yours. But the body is also your handiwork. For this it was made, to sanctify your name in this world. Master of all worlds, spare the work of your hands. I looked back at the moon. A small cloud had drifted across it. Now, he's sitting here. It's Saturday night, and he and another friend, Shlomo, they're having a kind of impromptu malava malka. They had a half a piece of bread that was left over from Shabbat and a little drop of wine that they had in a bottle from Kiddush and a half a can of sardines that was left over. And they're having an impromptu malava malka, the Saturday night feast, sitting on a rock next to a tank in the freezing Golan. And they're hoping to say the Kiddush HaChodesh. But a cloud has drifted over it. That's the symbol of the Jewish people on the decline. Shlomo put a hand on my shoulder. Softly, he began to sing B'Shafrir Chevyon. That's the title of Sabato's other book. One of the hymns, one of the Zmirot from Motzei Shabbat, which was a favorite of the Rebbe of Kloisenberg. According to the Rebbe's Chassidim, he had sung it to himself every Shabbat in the death camps at the time of Shalashudis at the third meal. The Rebbe of Kloisenberg, we don't have time to talk about him, but he was a very great and significant figure who lost his entire family in the in the in the Shoah. His great grandfather, the Tzaddik Rebbe Haim, of the great grandfather of the Rebbe of Kloisenberg, the Tzaddik Rebbe Haim of Zanz, sang it then too. In that hour of grace, as the Sabbath draws to a close, that hour, that is the hour of all hours, his face shining like an angel's. I stood there in silence. We watched the clouds cover the moon. We bowed to the right and to the left, each towards his friend, and we said, Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be upon you. It's part of the Kiddush HaChodesh. You turn to your friends and you wish them peace. We bowed to the soldier who never spoke and was no longer there, and we said, Peace be upon you. Peace be upon you. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem. I bowed to the heavens above. I aimed my thoughts at Dove and said, Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem. At that moment, when the moon peeks out from the terrible, depressing, enveloping darkness, from behind the clouds and from behind the fog and from behind the fog of war, they each say this line, which is part of the prayer, but it's not a greeting. It's the prayer that each soldier extends to his fellow and to himself. And this, too, is a prayer that's offered without a hair's breadth between heart and lips. And this is how the novel ends, with this hope of Shalom Aleichem and Shalom Aleinu. When we planned out this series, it was done not with a whole lot of thought, a little more thought than the planning that went into the Yom Kippur War, but not with a whole lot of thought. And I didn't even realize, we haven't even figured out that this session tonight would end on Hanukkah, but it really is quite appropriate. I don't think I have to put too fine a point on it. You're all kulanu chachamim, kulanu navonim. We can all connect the dots for ourselves. But I think this is a little bit the theme of Hanukkah, the light and the darkness, the hope that comes, and that the military victory that came with Hanukkah was also tied up with a spiritual victory for the Jewish nation and for the Jewish people, which is something, of course, that we so desperately need. It was a great pleasure sharing these thoughts with you over these 4 weeks. We had hoped that we were going to be having a series now live in Beit Agnon. So to the benefit of those from afar, you were able to join us online or through the recordings. I know many people have been listening to the recordings, and I appreciate the contacts that I've gotten by email. My email's there on the screen. You're welcome to contact me. But I hope that life will soon go back to normal, and we'll be able to meet again in Jerusalem. And I hope also that we'll be able to travel again sometime soon. I don't know when or where that will be too, but I hope, certainly for those of you that have been with us in the past, we hope we'll be able to schedule some of those trips. But again, just reviewing what we've done, from Shalom Aleichem to Bialik to Agnon to a contemporary writer who is very much alive and well and continuing his output of important writing, to Haim Sabato. I think taken as a whole, it covers some of the themes of some of what we've been experiencing, like rats in the maze, not knowing where the exit is. It's sometimes hard to get your head above it. But I think sometimes looking at the great writers that have come before helps shed a little light in the fog. So we wish you a Chanukah Sameach for you and for everyone, and good health to everyone, and safety to the Chayalim and to the hostages, should soon all be returned to their homes. Chag Sameach.